We're back, and I'm delighted to welcome to the programme Ian Wishart, author of Totalitaria. Good afternoon, Ian.
Good afternoon, Pippa. How are you?
Very well, thanks, and sorry about the slight delay there, but you stayed up beyond your bedtime, well past your bedtime. You are, of course, 12 hours ahead of us, and I'm delighted that you've been able to stay up for us. Thank you. Ian,
well, I can tell you what the rest of Friday holds.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very clever. The book that we're talking about here, it's actually not a new book. It's called Totalitaria. I've got it here in my hands. And the band across the back, it says, for the first time in history, governments are on the brink of being able to totally control your life. This is something which, as a concept, isn't, or as a discussion point, should we say, isn't really that new, is it?
No, it's not. But I think where it's going is that history teaches us that humans have always had an ambition to extend their power. And what we're seeing here now is the technology is coming in that effectively locks that stuff in place. The ambitions can now become real for the first time in human history. And what we're rapidly seeing unfold, and I guess, as you say, people are aware of it, but they're not necessarily joining all the dots, is an infrastructure is being put in place globally that will effectively control the planet and control your life.
Now, that's a great place to start because, I think the obvious one when anybody listening to that would immediately think about the technology that we use on a daily basis now in terms of our smartphones, internet, and everything that comes with that. And, obviously we've had revelations recently that we are being spied upon. Many people assume that that's for the good of the global population and it's designed to protect us. And many people seem unperturbed by it. Why should we be worried?
One of the first things I learned when I was a ministerial press secretary back in the 80s was that we used manufactured crises to distract the public from what was really going on. And it was often said in the New Zealand government that I worked for that we needed to create a crisis and then provide a solution as politicians to get the answer that we wanted and to get the result that we wanted. What you're seeing here is effectively a series of crises unfolding globally. And I guess the obvious one was 2001 and the attack on the Twin Towers. And the war on terror has been used as a mask to hide a whole lot of agendas that share a common aim. And what's happening is that we are, I don't think you'd find many people opposed to the idea of surveillance for the purposes of fighting terrorism. But the problem is, the moment that you put in place the infrastructure that's being used for that, that infrastructure stays in place and it can be used down the track for other things. And it's the other things that people are not aware of. They're not necessarily aware of the real agenda that's going on behind the scenes. So on the one hand, we accept a level of surveillance and searching at the airports and all the rest of it that goes with it. But and we say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. But that saying is only true if you really know what people are after.
So, it's a question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. And you are suggesting that even something, we won't get into too much detail about this particular issue, but even something like the bombing of the Twin Towers was potentially a catastrophe manufactured to reach an agenda, to be able to reach a certain goal on an agenda.
Yeah, just so people understand my position, I don't believe the Twin Towers attacks were faked or anything like that.
Yeah.
What I do know as a former political operative is that powers that be have used the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers as a convenient Trojan horse to sneak in a whole lot of new powers that will change the face of this planet and change your life.
Ian, I'm going to ask you before we continue, because I can already imagine people listening thinking, those two words which really get my back up, and those words are conspiracy theorists. Oh, here they are. Listen to these conspiracy theorists. Can you tell me and the listeners why that term is not relevant to what we're talking about?
Look, as an investigative journalist, we are trained to do one thing in particular, and that is follow the money. You always look at who benefits in a particular scenario. And in this particular case, you have age-old ambitions, which is power and control. I mean, you just have to look at Western civilization or any civilization at all. It is always about power and control. And all we have now is a perfect storm emerging whereby new technologies come online, a series of crises are here that effectively enable the political powers who want the control to scare the public into submission. and into agreeing to various scenarios that they're unfolding. For those who say conspiracy theory, I invite them to read Totalitaria. It's available on Amazon. It's got nearly 500 footnotes sourced back to the original documents. So this is another thing that I did as an investigative journalist. You can hear these sort of things discussed on late night talk shows and on websites with no references and so forth. There are millions of websites devoted to conspiracy theories around the world. What I wanted to do with Totalitaria is go right back to the source, right back to the horse's mouth, and see where these agendas were coming from and how good was the source material to prove it. And what I went back to United Nations documents, to American British government documents, to biographies written by the key players where they've said in their own words, this is what they want to achieve. Let's make no bones about this. The people who've been planning this want to achieve a totalitarian regime, not because they're nasty people, but because they believe that's the only way they can save the planet, in quote, unquote. And so anyone who sits there saying, well, this is just a conspiracy theory, read the book, then come back to me and tell me where the theory part is.
I can testify. I've got the book here in my hands as we speak, and I can testify that every assertion made by the author in this book does have a footnote justifying and categorising where that has come from. Everything is researchable, and that's the fact. You know, the fact is that on the one hand, we're talking perhaps of the internet being one of the tools, or certainly computers being one of the tools that are certainly implicated in the control of the population. On the other hand, it's a tool which gives us incredible freedom of information.
It does. It's a two-edged sword, as are all communications forms throughout history. But the computer technology is what allows the globe to be globally controlled. You know, you go back 100 years, and although the world was fairly united at the time, Western civilization had spread across the planet. The British Empire controlled 24% of the globe. The ability to control the world in real time did not exist. With computer technology today linking up markets and governments and households around the world, you know, the very fact that I'm sitting here speaking to you from a studio here in Auckland, New Zealand at 1:20 in the morning, our time, is testimony to how interconnected the globe now is. Now, with that, people can change how people are controlled, and we become very dependent on technology. We become very dependent on Google. We become very dependent on a whole host of things. And if our civilization was to suddenly have that material, that technology switched off, we'd be in chaos because we've lost some of our old skills about how to survive. So we are very vulnerable to those who want to control what we access in terms of information and what we do in terms of what we access on the internet and who we communicate with. I mean, if you look at in the Totalitaria book, one of the stories I recount is the origins of Facebook. And most people are not really aware. You know, Facebook was the dream child of Mark Zuckerberg and some of his mates. But very, very early on in the piece, they got investment from an agency connected to the Central Intelligence Agency. And the reason the CIA and others were interested in Facebook is because they saw the tremendous power of social networking, and they want to kickstart Facebook and make it a real public phenomenon. And as I say in the book, you actually go back 20 years before the creation of Facebook, and the Israeli Mossad was creating a program called Promise, which tried to do exactly the same thing, get in behind computer systems and find out who people were talking to, who their friends were, etc. Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Imgur and all these other social media tools that we now rely on daily for communication, keeping in touch with friends, have changed the privacy field forever globally. We now hand over our privacy to these enormous corporations whose investors include intelligence agencies from around the world. And we give out the details of who we speak to and who we network with. Now, as I said to you at the start of this interview, at the moment, the international attention is on terrorism. But 10, 15 years down the track, if a global government is put in place, which the United Nations is pushing for within that time frame, one of the things the United Nations is hot on is that people should all believe the same thing. They don't dissent. So the infrastructure that's being put in place today can crack down on dissenters tomorrow. That's where the laying our lives bare on Facebook suddenly becomes very relevant 10 years down the track.
Now, I mean, the idea that we are able to become so dependent so quickly, relatively quickly, if we think about the evolution of the human species, and we look at our dependence on social media, that's happened incredibly quickly. What is it about social media that makes us need it so much? We lived for millions of years without needing that kind of on-the-spot, immediate mass interaction with each other, and the accreditation that comes with having been recognised on Facebook or by a Twitter message being retweeted. What is it in the human psyche that makes us so dependent, so addicted to this so quickly?
You ask a really good question, and it's interesting. In researching Totalitaria, I looked at the trends in human history over the last 300 to 400 years. And one of the things that I examined was the nature, for example, of village life. And let's take Britain as an example. In Britain, it was traditional that people just did not stray from their villages. They might grow up and live and die in the same village that they were born in, and never having seen a village 8 miles down the road. And that was the way that people lived. There was a very tight-knit community, and outsiders were outsiders, and your village was your community. That was it. In this modern world, we still crave connectedness, but we work in office towers, we embrace iPods and entertainment and so forth, and we're more disconnected perhaps socially than we have been, at a face-to-face level. How many of us know our neighbours to speak to and to share a cup of coffee with, for example? And social media gives us that feeling of that village again, and the fact and the feeling of general goodwill. I say that advisedly because sometimes Facebook can be a bear pit, but nonetheless, we want that connection and that the sharing of just daily stories with people who share common interests. So social media has become our new village.
So that idea of Mark Zuckerberg as a student wanting to share, as you say in your book, pictures of, who's the hottest college student in his environment, which you believe that was just the exuberance of a student, but was perceived very quickly by the authorities who saw what a tool it could be. Do you think it literally happened like that?
Yeah, it did literally happen like that. I explain it in the book that, you go back to the 1980s and the intelligence agencies came up with this computer program called Promise that they sold. They didn't explain it fully to governments around the world, but they sold it to governments around the world as a database program. They didn't explain that the CIA and the Israeli Mossad had a back door into that computer program so that every computer it was downloaded onto, say it was for the British Justice Department or the Spanish Department of Transport, whatever, the program would suck up the information on particular individuals, whoever the CIA or the Israeli Mossad wanted to look at, through the back door. And what it was trying to do was build up a network of their contacts. And this was, again, in the hunt for terrorists and that sort of thing. They wanted to know who these people were linked to, who they were getting inspired by, who they were talking to, who their friends were, where they went on a Friday night if the power authorities or anyone else could tell, or phone authorities could tell them. And so... But it was very hard because people were more privacy-based back in the 80s because computers were not widespread. And we still had a view that the state was the state and we had a right to our privacy. A person's home was their castle. Cut forward to the Facebook generation, and we've given our privacy away. And you would not believe how much the intelligence agencies are rolling on the floor laughing at the fact that the public are willingly sharing now openly on things like Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere, details that they were begging for 25 years ago. And that's the paradigm shift that we've gone through. And it's a bit like boiling frog syndrome. I can speak to people in audiences today, and it's like a light bulb suddenly goes off, and they realize, hey, this is what we've done. We've come a 180-degree change in the space of a generation in terms of the way we view our relationship to the state and what the state should have access to. And this is the thing. It's like we're being conditioned subconsciously to open up our lives for scrutiny. And if we've got nothing to hide, we've got nothing to fear. But again, as I said, you don't know what's coming down the track 10 10 years from now.
That's right. Slowly catch a monkey. I mean, we have been slowly conditioned, and you know, the propensity towards becoming addicted to these tools is obviously great, and it's worked a treat. And I consider myself to be a fairly questioning and relatively intelligent individual who doesn't accept what's put in front of them, and I get frustrated that many people will really just not entertain any of the type of things that we're talking about here. But even within my own realm of experience, you know, I something really struck a chord with me actually reading on past the health and the food parts, but it's just towards the end of those in your book, which we'll come back to if we've got time in a minute. But that was towards the idea of fluoride. You're writing about fluoride. Now, you know, for years I've known that fluoride is toxic, and I can remember years ago, you know, thinking to myself, I must avoid fluoride. Fluoride is toxic and it's dangerous, and it's used as a tool of control. And until I picked up your book and was reading it, I'd forgotten that I used to think like that. And I suddenly thought, that's what fluoride's doing to me. You know, fluoride, as you assert it, is actually toxic enough to actually dampen our intelligence. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, and the irony is, as we speak about this right now, 6 hours ago, a New Zealand High Court judge in a landmark ruling in this country ruled that local councils had a right to fluoridate water systems regardless of protests by individuals who said you can't medicate me nationally. And the logic of the High Court was that fluoride is not a medication. Well, it's being given into the water supplies for the purposes of medical treatment of tooth decay in children and so forth. So it raises some fundamental questions. But what I did with the fluoride chapters in Totalitaria, I decided to go back to square one on this. And again, these are all fully sourced in the book. You can read the studies. I've put the footnotes in there with the studies. There are numerous studies from around the world now that show that fluoride dumbs down IQ, but sometimes by up to 7 or 10 IQ points, which is huge. It's worse than licking lead paint. We don't use lead paint anymore because of the danger it was to children. And yet we're using substances that can be just as toxic, if not more so, in terms of their impact on the intelligence of our population. And, you know, it's very clear evidence. It's set out in the book. The footnotes to the studies are there. You can read them in PubMed and elsewhere. There's absolutely no doubt. And yet, as you said, people are just conditioned to accept everything that we've been given in terms of propaganda. We need it for tooth decay and so forth. We need it for this. We need it for that. But it's a toxic chemical. You find out it's a waste product from industrial processes. And another thing that I touch on in the book, which is related to this, is the ingredients in our food. I mean, there are something like 10,000 food additives used in food. The US authorities don't know what thousands of those additives actually are. They've never been independently tested, and yet they're in our food every single day. We trust as the public in our authorities to look after us, but our authorities are doing deals behind the scenes with big conglomerates. And again, people can say conspiracy theory. I say read the book, read the footnotes, read the quotations from the authorities themselves, what they're saying behind the scenes. There is a cynicism out there in terms of the approach of politicians and big business to the ordinary citizen that is very, very unhealthy. That's why I say, if that is there now, what's it going to be like in 10 years' time when the United Nations has its final push for global governance, which they're drawing together already? In 10 years' time, they don't want dissent. They don't want people questioning their motives and their means.
What do you think potentially could stand in the way of their aims?
I think the point of writing this book, Totalitaria, is to raise awareness. It's one of those things, and I think you'd agree if you've read it. It's one of those books that is so shocking, and the reviews on Amazon make this point. It's so impacting that there's no way I can summarize it in a radio interview and give it any meaning. We can skate across the surface, but you have to read the evidence for yourself and see it in context and see the footnotes and the citations for yourself before you'll believe some of the stuff, because it's absolutely shocking.
I mean, I want to stress that this book is comprehensive. You know, as Ian's just said, we're just skating across the surface. But this book is comprehensive. I mean, the whole puzzle is fitted together immaculately by you, the author. Let me ask you, how long did it take you to put this book together?
Well, it's been a work in progress. I mean, it's the research that's gone into it has been over several years, and it's partly because I've researched other books on similar themes over the years, and I've pulled together folders and files and set up research lines on various things, and they finally all came together for this particular book. It took me about 5 or 6 months to write.
Go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, my motivation for doing it is that I really believe the public need to be awake to this. This is not a light at the end of the tunnel. This is a train roaring down the tunnel towards us. And if people don't make themselves aware about what's coming, about what their political masters are actually seeking to do to them 10 years down the track, then you'll be in no position to fight it when you finally realise what's going on.
What about now? Sorry, Ian, I want to ask you this because we haven't got much time left. You must have come up. I mean, you're really probing into some pretty some subjects which really get into the heart of things that are carried out by corporate business, which really, with political end, which is kept from us, the general public. And you really dig deep into that. You must have come up against some serious resistance in research.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, when talking to radio hosts here in New Zealand, there's one in particular that I do a weekly show with, and he's been getting emails from people blasting him for daring to release this information. They're angry that I've spilt the beans on what's coming. That's the level of anger that there is within the higher realms of power. They are furious. But nonetheless, you can't stop. This is the beauty of being an independent publisher. We have the ability to get the story out there, and people are reading it.
Would you have an idea of how many people this has reached? How many copies have been sold so far?
Well, to give you an example, we did a big interview on America's Coast to Coast AM show, which is their big overnight talk show nationwide, and I think it has a horrendously huge listenership. I think 4 million for the actual radio stations, and there's about another 20 million listening on the internet. And the book went nuts. It topped in the top 100 on Amazon that night, and was a huge reach. In fact, I guess the indication as to what this is, I was listening on New Year's Eve to one of the local radio networks here in New Zealand, and they were doing their New Year's Eve show, and a guy had just come back from Colorado, and he said, you wouldn't believe this, because the host was asking what he'd done over in Colorado. He says he was on a business trip, and he said, you wouldn't believe this. They're all talking about Ian Wishart over in Denver. I said, you're kidding me. And but that's the power of the book, and it's gone viral across America. And this is our first interview with you reaching into the British and European market, because I haven't paid any attention to that yet. I've been so busy with New Zealand and Australia and the US. So you really had the European exclusive on this book.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But Totalitaria is available. You can read the reviews on Amazon, and it's one of those things that if I could. Yeah, it's 150,000 words. If I could summarize 150,000 words in a Twitter comment, it'd be great. But I can't. The whole reason the book is long and a page turner is so that you can get the full story, and that it's really important.
But let me tell you that it's easy to read. It's not laborious. It's not full of facts that that really sort of leave the reader struggling to understand. It is a fluent read, and I can't stress that enough, because once you pick it up, I promise you won't put it down. And there's anybody who's cynical about listening to Ian and what he's talking about, all I can say is pick up this book, open it, and I can guarantee that somewhere in this book you'll find a chapter which makes your jaw drop, because you'll be able to relate to it, and that will make you read the rest of the book. It's really quite amazing. Ian, we are out of time. I'd love to invite you on again in the not too distant future, if that's all right with you.
Not a problem, and absolutely happy to take questions from people as well.
Lovely. Ian Wishart, who is the author of Totalitaria, available now on Amazon. Wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you.
All the best.